Georgia, 1944. The German women heard the gate lock behind them, and one whispered, "They locked us up for the soldiers." Elsa Reinhardt stayed awake all night, waiting for boots outside the barracks door. But something felt wrong. The American guards never looked at them, never whistled, never stepped too close. Then Elsa saw Sergeant Thomas Miller stop a young soldier at a white line painted in the mud. "You don't cross that line without Corporal Collins," he said coldly. Later that night, during a thunderstorm, Elsa watched Thomas repair their leaking roof from outside in pouring rain, refusing to enter the women's barracks. Then she heard him say the words that changed everything. "Prisoners, not property. They left us here for them," whispered a voice through the damp Georgian night as rain traced rivulets down the wooden slats of the barracks. Elsa Reinhardt, 26, a nurse with careful hands and a mind trained to observe, pressed her back against the rough wall, listening. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, thick with the scent of humidity and something metallic she couldn't name. Outside, the footsteps of soldiers echoed softly on the mud-caked ground, distant, measured, never close enough to feel threatening, yet close enough to be felt in the chest. She drew her knees up, clasped her hands, and watched shadows move beneath the dim glow of a single floodlight that washed the compound in silvery rectangles. Thomas Miller, a sergeant with broad shoulders and calm eyes, stood by the perimeter fence, his posture straight, his gaze scanning the darkness but never turning toward them. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply existed at a distance, a human presence that was both a boundary and a shield. A bolt of lightning flickered, illuminating the lines of barbed wire and the neat rows of barracks. And for a brief heartbeat, Elsa imagined the entire world frozen in that flash, a world where fear had a shape, a sound, and a measure, and she measured it against the measured steps outside. Inside, the women whispered, voices hushed and trembling, telling stories of their journey, of the long days at sea, the trains across the South, the promises of cruelty whispered by propaganda, the faces they had imagined of their captors, faces that never appeared. Elsa thought of her own hands, calloused from field hospitals, remembering the precise, clean movements that had once saved lives and wondering if they could save her dignity now. The rain fell harder, drumming against the corrugated roof, making the thin metal moan, and she shivered, not from cold but from anticipation, from the taut string of tension wound tight across the camp. Thomas did not move toward them. He never had. And in that stillness, Elsa realized something she had not allowed herself to believe, that respect could be enforced without touch, that boundaries could carry care. Somewhere near the mess hall, a corporal laughed quietly, and the sound felt distant and irrelevant, swallowed by the rain and the dark. Elsa's eyes traced the lines of the compound, noting the distance, the careful separation, and the rhythm of footsteps outside. The women moved silently, folding bedding, straightening utensils, performing the mechanical rituals of camp life, while the guards remained in their places, never intruding, never alarming, never asserting themselves beyond the law and the basic code of humanity. Elsa felt the weight of months of captivity, of propaganda, of assumed enmity, lift slightly in the quiet calculation of distance. It was a kind of freedom she had not known she could possess. In her mind, she began to name the moments, the step taken not toward her, the door left closed, the gaze that did not wander to judge or provoke. Each act of restraint was an act of humanity. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet cotton fields from the surrounding countryside. Elsa inhaled deeply, tasting the rain and the dark and the strange comfort of being watched yet unmolested. She imagined the soldiers' thoughts, disciplined, precise, aware of fear's potency and the power of measured distance. Lightning flashed again, revealing the contours of his face, sharp against the night, calm, unwavering. She pressed her hands over her mouth, swallowed hard, and let the realization settle. They were not imprisoned for their captors' whims. They were protected by the quiet, deliberate choices of men who understood that dignity could be preserved without words, without touch. Thomas Miller made no speech, offered no comfort, but his discipline and distance spoke in a language the women recognized slowly, a language of respect, of acknowledgement, of unspoken promises. Elsa glanced around at the other women, saw the subtle shift in posture, the tiny exhalations of relief, the softened lines of shoulders that had carried months of tension. Outside, the rain began to ease, the ground steaming as water pooled in low spots, reflecting the dim lights. The night stretched long and measured, each moment a study in restraint, each breath a proof of unspoken care. She allowed herself a small, tentative hope, the kind that flickers when no one is looking, the kind born of understanding that freedom need not be loud to be real. Somewhere beyond the fence, the compound seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for dawn to confirm what night had already revealed. That distance, carefully kept, could be a lifeline. That respect, meticulously maintained, could heal where words had failed, and that in this quiet, in this deliberate balance of proximity and separation, Elsa began to trust not the promises of stories, not the appearances of strangers, but the careful, patient humanity embedded in a simple act of letting others remain whole while observing them with care. Morning arrived slowly over Camp Greene, the Georgia mist rising from the wet ground in pale ribbons that curled around the fence posts and drifted between the barracks like smoke from an extinguished fire. Elsa Reinhardt woke before the whistle, her eyes opening to the faint creak of wood settling in the damp air. Around her, the women still slept beneath thin army blankets, their breathing soft and uneven after another restless night. She sat up carefully, pressing her bare feet against the cold floorboards, and listened. Outside, boots moved through mud with measured rhythm. Not hurried, not aggressive, predictable. That was what unsettled her most. Predictability. In Europe, war had taught her that men with power became louder the moment they realized no one could stop them. Here, silence seemed to carry authority instead. A whistle cut through the dawn. Short, sharp, functional. The women rose immediately, moving with practiced discipline. Gray uniforms rustled softly in the half-light, while metal cups clinked against wash basins. Elsa braided her blonde hair tightly behind her head and buttoned her coat against the lingering chill. Through the narrow barracks window, she saw Sergeant Thomas Miller standing near the mess hall with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, steam rising from a tin cup in his hand. He did not bark orders. He did not stare at the women filing into formation. He simply checked the perimeter with calm eyes that missed nothing. A young American soldier approached him, barely older than 19, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The boy laughed about something Elsa could not hear and started walking toward the women's barracks shortcut across the yard. Thomas stopped him instantly with 2 fingers raised in the air. The movement was small but absolute. The young soldier froze. Thomas pointed toward the outer gravel path instead. The longer route. The soldier nodded without complaint and changed direction immediately. Elsa watched the exchange in silence. It would have been easier for the soldier to walk through the center yard, faster by nearly 50 yards. Yet he obeyed without argument. The women formed 2 lines outside the barracks while the morning fog wrapped itself around the camp lights. Somewhere beyond the fence, a train whistle echoed faintly across the countryside. Elsa imagined freight cars moving through sleeping towns filled with warm kitchens and ordinary people drinking coffee before work. The thought felt strangely distant now, like remembering someone else's memory. Corporal Mary Collins stepped forward beside the women, her olive uniform crisp despite the humidity. She carried herself with quiet competence, a clipboard balanced against her hip. Elsa noticed immediately that Mary always arrived first whenever inspections involved the women. Always. Even the guards waited for her before approaching the barracks doors. Mess hall in 5 minutes, Mary said evenly. Ground is slippery. Watch your footing. Her voice carried no contempt, no pity, only practical concern. The women nodded and began moving across the muddy yard toward breakfast. Elsa kept her eyes forward but noticed details automatically. 2 guards standing near the gate turned away respectfully while the women passed within a few feet of them. Another lowered his cigarette and stepped backward to widen the walkway. Tiny adjustments, tiny distances, yet each one seemed intentional. Inside the mess hall, the warmth struck her first. Heat from industrial stoves mixed with the smell of bacon grease, coffee, and fresh bread. Steam fogged the windows while cooks moved behind serving counters with mechanical efficiency. The women collected trays in silence. Scrambled eggs, toast, grits, real butter wrapped in wax paper. Elsa stared briefly at the butter before sitting down beside Anna Weiss, the youngest prisoner in their barracks. Anna held her spoon uncertainly. "Do you think it is real?" she whispered in German. Elsa glanced toward the kitchen. "The food." Anna nodded slightly. "The kindness." Elsa did not answer immediately. Across the room, Sergeant Miller stood near the entrance speaking quietly with Mary Collins. Even indoors, he kept his distance from the women's tables, never crossing into their section unless necessary. He leaned slightly while listening to Mary, his expression focused, respectful, professional. Then one of the cooks waved him over to inspect paperwork near the back office. To reach it, he would have needed to pass directly beside Elsa's table. Instead, Thomas walked around the entire outer aisle of the mess hall, adding nearly 30 extra steps to avoid cutting between the women. Elsa watched him disappear into the kitchen corridor. "No," she said softly to Anna after a long moment. "I think the kindness is real." Rain began again before noon. Light at first, then harder. Fat drops hammered against the tin roofs while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the cotton fields. Work details were canceled due to flooding near the drainage ditch, so the women remained inside the barracks mending uniforms and sorting supply crates. Elsa sat beside the window sewing a torn sleeve while the storm darkened the sky to slate gray. Water leaked steadily through a crack above the far bunk, dripping into a metal pail with slow hollow taps. Across the room, Anna laughed quietly for the first time in days after another woman attempted to imitate an American accent. The sound startled Elsa more than the thunder. Laughter had become unfamiliar. Outside, guards hurried between buildings wearing rain capes that snapped sharply in the wind. Then Elsa saw Thomas Miller crossing the yard carrying a wooden toolbox beneath one arm. Rain soaked his uniform instantly. He stopped near the barracks steps, but did not enter. Instead, he removed his hat and knocked firmly on the outer wall. "Corporal Collins," he called through the door. Moments later, Mary opened it from inside. Thomas handed her the toolbox without stepping over the threshold. "Roof leak near the north bunks?" he asked. Mary nodded. "I will handle interior repairs." Thomas glanced upward toward the damaged roofline. "I will patch from outside." Elsa watched from across the room as rain streamed down his face and darkened his sleeves. He could have entered easily. The leak was minor. The women were prisoners. No regulation would have stopped him. Yet he stayed exactly where he was, boots planted outside in the mud, while Mary climbed onto a stool inside to position a repair tarp beneath the dripping crack. Thunder shook the windows again. Thomas moved along the exterior wall, hammering nails into loose boards while rainwater poured from the roof edges around him. Elsa stood slowly and approached the window. Through the wet glass, she saw him balancing carefully on a ladder slick with rain, one hand gripping the roofline while the other secured a canvas sheet against the storm. Not once did he look through the window. Not once did his eyes wander toward the women watching from inside. His focus remained entirely on the repair itself, precise and controlled despite the weather. Anna stepped beside Elsa quietly. "Why does he do that?" she whispered. Elsa stared at the rain sliding down the glass between them and the man outside. "Because he knows we are afraid," she answered. The storm continued all afternoon, but the leak stopped completely. By evening, the barracks smelled faintly of wet wood and soap, while lantern light flickered against the walls. Elsa lay awake again after lights out, listening to distant thunder fading toward the horizon. Somewhere outside, boots moved slowly along the perimeter fence in steady rhythm. Measured, predictable, safe. She closed her eyes and remembered something her father once told her before the war changed everything. Character reveals itself most clearly when power goes unobserved. In the darkness of Camp Greene, surrounded by fences and floodlights and armed guards, Elsa Reinhardt began to understand that dignity was not always restored through grand gestures. Sometimes it returned quietly, one careful step backward at a time. 3 days later, the heat returned with full southern force. Georgia's sunlight poured across Camp Greene in white sheets, so bright the gravel paths looked almost silver. By noon, the wooden guard towers shimmered behind waves of rising heat, and even the pine trees beyond the fence stood motionless beneath the weight of the air. Elsa Reinhardt sat beside the barracks window, mending a torn sleeve, while sweat gathered beneath the collar of her gray uniform. Somewhere outside, cicadas screamed from the trees in endless rhythm, loud enough to feel physical. Summer in the American South did not resemble Europe. It pressed against the body differently. Wet, heavy, alive. Across the compound, guards moved slower beneath the heat. Their uniforms darkened at the shoulders while canteens knocked softly against their belts. Yet the routines never changed. Distances remained exact. Boundaries remained untouched. Every movement in the camp seemed measured by invisible rules stronger than fences. Elsa noticed them constantly now. The way soldiers stopped several feet short when speaking to the women. The way doors were knocked on before opening. The way Sergeant Thomas Miller always removed his hat before addressing older prisoners, even though they were enemies. Small things. Tiny things. But war had taught her that small things revealed character faster than speeches ever could. That afternoon, the women were assigned to laundry duty behind the mess hall. Steam rolled from giant industrial washers, while rows of uniforms hung from clotheslines stretched between pine posts. The scent of soap and wet cotton drifted through the humid air. Elsa worked beside Anna Weiss, folding dry towels into neat stacks, while Corporal Mary Collins supervised inventory nearby. From across the yard came the sound of laughter. American soldiers. Young voices. Easy voices. Elsa glanced toward the maintenance shed and saw several guards sitting beneath its shade during break, sleeves rolled above their elbows, drinking cold Coca-Cola bottles packed in ice. Condensation glistened down the glass. One soldier tossed peanuts toward another while a radio played low-swing music somewhere inside the building. The scene felt impossibly ordinary. Not war. Not occupation. Just young men hiding from the heat in another American summer. Then Anna dropped a towel. It slipped beneath the outer clothesline and landed near the gravel path bordering the guard station. She froze immediately. The towel rested less than 6 feet from two soldiers drinking beneath the shade. One of them noticed it instantly. Elsa saw the hesitation cross Anna's face. In Europe, approaching armed men alone often meant danger. Everyone in the laundry yard felt the tension at once. Even Mary Collins paused while checking her clipboard. The nearest soldier stood slowly, brushing dust from his trousers. He was tall, perhaps 20 years old, freckles scattered across his sunburned face. For one terrible second, Anna looked ready to apologize for existing. But instead of picking up the towel himself, the soldier stepped backward. "Ma'am," he called respectfully toward Mary Collins without crossing the line between the work yard and the women's area. "Need assistance over here." Mary walked over calmly, retrieved the towel herself, then handed it back to Anna without comment. The soldier nodded once and returned to the shade. That was all. No staring, no teasing, no unnecessary conversation. Yet Elsa noticed Anna's hands trembling slightly as she folded the towel against her chest. "You are all right," Elsa whispered softly in German. Anna stared toward the soldiers. He could have picked it up himself. Elsa looked across the bright yard where heat shimmered above the gravel like water. "Yes," she answered quietly. But he knew why he should not. The afternoon dragged beneath crushing humidity. Shirts clung to skin. Soap dried slowly on damp fingers. Every few minutes Mary ordered water breaks beneath the shade while thunderheads gathered far beyond the pine trees. Elsa carried a crate of folded linens toward the storage shed shortly before evening meal when she heard raised voices near the outer fence. Not angry. Frustrated. Two American soldiers stood arguing beside the supply truck while Sergeant Thomas Miller listened with folded arms. One of the younger guards gestured toward the women's compound while speaking quickly. "I am just saying it makes no sense," the young soldier complained. "We are guarding prisoners, not attending church socials." Thomas said nothing at first. He simply watched the heat waves ripple above the dirt road beyond the fence. Then he spoke quietly enough that Elsa almost missed it. "You know why those rules exist?" The younger guard shrugged. "Because headquarters worries about complaints." Thomas shifted his gaze toward the women's barracks across the compound. His voice remained calm, controlled. "No," he said, "because fear spreads faster than orders." The younger soldier looked confused. Thomas continued watching the compound while thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. "Most of them arrived expecting humiliation," he said. "Every unnecessary step toward them confirms it." The wind stirred slightly, carrying the smell of rain through the camp. Elsa stood motionless beside the storage wall, hidden partially behind stacked crates, listening. "You keep distance long enough," Thomas said quietly. "Eventually they breathe easier." Silence followed. The younger soldier lowered his eyes. I did not think of it that way, Sergeant. Thomas nodded once. That is why I have to. Elsa remained still long after the conversation ended. Above the compound, dark storm clouds rolled slowly across the fading sky, turning the sunlight copper and gold. Laundry lines snapped sharply in the rising wind while guards hurried to secure loose tarps before the rain arrived. Across the yard, Anna laughed softly at something Mary Collins said while carrying blankets indoors ahead of the storm. The sound drifted through the heavy air like something fragile returning to life. Elsa leaned against the storage wall and closed her eyes briefly. In another world, another country, another war, power had often announced itself through closeness, through intrusion, through fear. Here, authority revealed itself through restraint instead, through deliberate absence, through men choosing not to exercise every ounce of control available to them. The first raindrops struck the dirt hard enough to leave dark circles in the dust. Then came the storm. Warm southern rain crashed against rooftops while thunder rolled low across the Georgia countryside. Barracks windows rattled softly in their frames. Inside, the women prepared for another wet night beneath flickering lantern light. Elsa sat on her bunk polishing mud from her work shoes when the outer door opened suddenly. Every woman in the room stiffened instinctively. But it was only Mary Collins carrying extra blankets against the evening chill. Behind her, standing outside beneath the rain without entering, Sergeant Thomas Miller held a wooden crate against one hip. Dry socks from Supply, he said simply. Water streamed from the brim of his cap. Mary took the crate from him while he remained beyond the doorway in the downpour. One of the older German women looked up carefully. Danke, she whispered almost involuntarily. Thomas paused. Rain hammered the roof between them. Then he gave a small nod without stepping closer. You are welcome, ma'am. He closed the door gently behind him. No dramatic gesture followed. No speech. Only the sound of his boots fading slowly through rainwater outside, while the women stared silently at the crate of dry socks sitting on the barracks floor like evidence of something larger than supplies. Elsa reached down and touched the rough wool fabric beside her. Dry, warm, clean. Around the room, women began speaking again in hushed voices while thunder rolled farther away into the dark. Anna sat cross-legged on her bunk, holding a pair of socks in both hands, as though she still did not entirely understand the world she had entered. Elsa looked toward the closed barracks door, where rain shadows flickered beneath the lantern light. Then she realized something that unsettled her more deeply than fear ever had. She no longer waited for the moment the kindness would end. The next Sunday arrived quieter than the others. Rain had washed the Georgia dust from the camp roads during the night, leaving the morning air unusually cool for August. Mist drifted low across the compound, while sunlight filtered through pine branches in pale streaks that touched the fence wire with silver. Elsa Reinhardt stood outside the barracks before roll call, breathing deeply. Somewhere beyond the camp, church bells rang faintly across the countryside. The sound startled her. In Germany, bells had become rare beneath war and smoke. Here, they still marked ordinary mornings. Around her, the women moved more slowly than usual, their shoulders less rigid now, their eyes no longer fixed constantly on the ground. Even fear, Elsa realized, grew tired eventually. Sergeant Thomas Miller crossed the yard carrying a clipboard beneath one arm and a steaming coffee tin in the other. He wore the same calm expression he always carried, neither warm nor cold, simply controlled. Yet Elsa noticed something different immediately. His left sleeve was stitched roughly near the elbow, repaired by hand with uneven thread. Not army work. Improvised. The kind of repair someone made quickly because replacement uniforms were delayed. Thomas stopped near Corporal Mary Collins and reviewed work assignments quietly while guards assembled by the outer gate. Then the morning whistle sounded. Laundry crews moved east. Kitchen crews west. Elsa's group received greenhouse detail near the maintenance sheds where vegetables for the mess hall were grown beneath long canvas covers. The greenhouse sat near the edge of camp beside a gravel service road lined with stacked supply crates and fuel drums. Humidity collected beneath the canvas roof almost immediately after sunrise, turning the air warm and heavy with the scent of damp soil and tomato vines. Elsa worked beside Anna Weiss transplanting lettuce seedlings into wooden trays while insects buzzed lazily against the screened windows. Water dripped rhythmically from overhead pipes into shallow irrigation trenches cut through the dirt floor. It felt strangely peaceful, almost civilian. Around mid-morning, one of the older women accidentally knocked over a crate of glass jars while unloading supplies. The crash echoed sharply through the greenhouse. Glass shattered across the concrete floor in glittering pieces. Instantly, the room froze. Old instincts. Sudden noise still carried memories of danger. Two American guards approached the doorway automatically. Elsa saw Anna stiffen beside her, but Sergeant Miller arrived first. He stepped inside only far enough to assess the damage before stopping several feet short of the women. "Everyone stay clear," he said calmly. "No anger. No shouting. Just measured control." He glanced once at the broken glass scattered across the floor. "Shoes are too thin for that mess." One of the guards reached instinctively for a broom near the wall, but Thomas raised a hand slightly. "Hold up." He looked toward Mary Collins, who had entered behind him. "Can you handle cleanup?" Mary nodded immediately. "Of course." Thomas stepped backward again toward the doorway. "Appreciate it." Then he turned to the women. "Nobody moves until the glass is gone." Elsa watched him carefully. The moment could have been insignificant. Simple camp procedure. Yet she understood what he had done. Broken glass meant kneeling close. Meant bodies moving through tight spaces. Meant unnecessary proximity. Thomas avoided all of it without making the women feel weak or fragile. He simply adjusted the situation quietly until dignity remained intact for everyone involved. Mary began sweeping the glass while the guards waited outside beneath the shade. One of the younger soldiers muttered something under his breath. Thomas answered without looking at him. "Respect is not complicated, private." Silence followed. Immediately, Elsa lowered her eyes to the seedlings in her hands while something tightened unexpectedly in her chest. The morning stretched onward beneath soft heat and filtered sunlight. Around noon, lunch trucks arrived beside the greenhouse yard carrying metal containers filled with soup, bread, and cold apples packed in ice. The women lined up quietly beneath the trees while guards distributed trays. Elsa noticed Thomas standing farther back than usual, near the gravel road, speaking with another sergeant she did not recognize. The man was taller, broader, with hard eyes and a cigarette hanging loosely from his mouth. Even from a distance, Elsa sensed tension immediately. The unfamiliar sergeant glanced openly toward the women several times while speaking. Thomas remained expressionless. Then the stranger laughed about something and started walking toward the lunch line. Thomas stepped directly into his path. Not aggressively, not dramatically, simply enough to stop him. The stranger frowned. Words passed between them too quietly to hear clearly over the sound of cicadas and truck engines. Then the unfamiliar sergeant shrugged dismissively and walked away toward the motor pool. Thomas stayed where he was for a moment longer, watching until the man disappeared behind the maintenance sheds. Elsa pretended to focus on her soup, but she noticed the way Mary Collins exhaled slowly beside the serving table afterward. Later that afternoon, clouds gathered again over the camp. Thick gray formations rolled low across the sky, while thunder murmured somewhere beyond the trees. Work crews hurried to finish assignments before the storm arrived. Elsa carried trays of harvested vegetables toward the mess hall storage room when she passed near the administration building. An open window carried voices into the humid air. "You are too careful with them," the unfamiliar sergeant was saying sharply inside. Elsa slowed instinctively beside the outer wall. Thomas answered in his usual calm tone. "No, I follow regulations. They are prisoners." "Yes." Silence lingered briefly. Then Thomas spoke again, quieter this time. "Which means they depend entirely on our choices." Rain began, falling softly against the roof above them. Elsa stood motionless beneath the window while water darkened the dirt road outside. "You think distance changes anything?" the stranger asked. Thomas answered immediately. "It changes everything." The storm broke fully minutes later. Warm rain swept across Camp Greene in silver sheets while guards secured equipment beneath tarps and prisoners hurried toward the barracks through rising mud. Elsa reached the women's quarters soaked through to the sleeves, her blonde hair damp against her collar. Inside, lanterns flickered against wooden walls while thunder rolled overhead like distant artillery softened by miles of rain. Anna sat cross-legged on her bunk, drying her shoes beside a small towel. "You heard them?" she whispered as Elsa entered. Elsa paused. "He protects the distance," Anna said quietly. even from other soldiers. Outside, boots splashed through puddles during evening patrol. Somewhere near the fence line, a guard laughed briefly before the sound disappeared beneath thunder. Elsa removed her wet coat slowly and hung it beside the stove to dry. For several seconds, she simply watched rainwater slide down the barracks windows in thin silver lines. Then she spoke without turning around. "Back home," she said softly, "we were taught powerful men become dangerous when nobody is watching." Anna looked up from her bunk. Elsa stared toward the rain beyond the glass. "But here," she continued quietly, "I think he behaves the same way whether anyone sees him or not." The lantern light trembled gently against the ceiling while thunder rolled farther away into the dark Georgia countryside. Around the room, women folded blankets, brushed mud from shoes, prepared for another night inside the fenced world that no longer felt exactly like a prison. Elsa sat carefully on the edge of her bunk and touched the damp sleeve of her coat. Outside, Sergeant Thomas Miller continued his patrol through rain and darkness, keeping the same careful distance he always had. Not because regulations demanded it, not because someone was watching, but because somewhere inside him existed a line he had decided long ago never to cross. The following morning arrived with a horizon painted pale pink and soft lavender as the sun rose over Camp Greene. Elsa Reinhardt stepped onto the damp yard early, carrying a wicker basket filled with freshly picked radishes and lettuces from the greenhouse. Dew glistened on the blades of grass while birds called faintly from the trees along the perimeter. The women had already begun preparing breakfast for themselves in quiet, disciplined motion, each movement deliberate, unhurried, respectful of space and distance. Elsa approached Anna Weiss, who knelt beside a small basin washing herbs, and placed a few leaves into the basket gently. "Do you remember the first day we came?" Elsa whispered. Anna glanced up briefly, eyes still soft from sleep. "It felt like the world had stopped," she said in German. Elsa nodded. "And yet everything moved anyway." The morning air held a weight of anticipation, charged yet calm. Guards patrolled in pairs, boots making steady thuds across the gravel paths, but they never drew near unnecessarily. Sergeant Thomas Miller emerged from the shadows of the mess hall with his tin coffee cup in hand. The sunlight glinted off the metal rim. His presence, steady and exacting, measured the boundaries of the camp with quiet authority. He did not speak to the women as he passed. His distance was deliberate, a buffer that conveyed both protection and trust. Elsa's gaze followed him while she carried the basket to the center of the yard where Mary Collins was already arranging trays of vegetables for sorting. Anna followed, tentative at first, adjusting to the rhythm of work and the cadence of the camp. Beyond the fence, the wind rustled the tall pines, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and sun-warmed leaves. Thomas stopped at the edge of the vegetable beds, observing the activity without intrusion. Even when the younger guards moved clumsily, approaching too near the women, Thomas positioned himself strategically between the two groups without a word. It was a choreography that ensured respect without command, a lesson unspoken yet immediately understood. Elsa and Anna began sorting the radishes by size, the coolness of the morning air raising. Gooseflesh on their arms. Conversation remained minimal. Each woman spoke in whispers, allowing the sounds of work and the environment to dominate. The rhythm of water running from the small troughs, the scrape of wooden crates across gravel, the distant hum of a truck engine starting. All these details painted a cinematic tableau, precise and vivid. Mid-morning, a sudden clatter echoed from the storage shed where the women kept spare crates of seedlings. Elsa's heart jumped. A stack of wooden trays had toppled, scattering soil across the floor. Guards moved toward the noise reflexively, but Thomas raised a hand, halting them. He approached slowly, carefully, maintaining a respectful distance. Mary Collins stepped forward to guide the cleanup. The women knelt to gather soil and trays, their fingers tracing the curves of the wooden containers and the soft earth. Thomas remained near the doorway, observing, his expression inscrutable yet calm, ensuring safety without asserting power unnecessarily. Elsa noticed the subtle communication between Thomas and Mary, the shared glance, the nod, the quiet understanding that the women's dignity remained intact. The morning progressed. By noon, the sun had climbed high, turning the gravel paths bright and white under the August light. Elsa and Anna carried trays of prepared greens to the mess hall storage area, passing rows of sleeping quarters where other women folded laundry and organized personal items. Each step they took was measured, careful, a quiet testament to a camp operating under new rhythms of trust. Thomas passed them at the edge of the yard, clipboard tucked under one arm. He nodded slightly, not to command, not to guide, simply acknowledging their presence. The women nodded back automatically, understanding the gesture's significance. Lunch arrived in metal containers, steam rising in gentle clouds. Elsa arranged the vegetables on the serving tables while the women lined up silently, collecting their portions. Thomas lingered at a distance again, not part of the distribution, merely present. The moment held a rhythm that was both mundane and profound. Each tray carried sustenance, but also the affirmation of safety, boundaries, and attention. In the early afternoon, a light rain began, thin at first, then heavier, striking the rooftops and gravel with steady percussion. The women moved beneath the eaves, baskets in hand, water soaking their uniforms, but leaving spirits unbroken. Thomas watched from the porch of the mess hall, his presence steady and calm, unmoving except for occasional adjustments to keep the younger guards attentive. Elsa carried a small basket of freshly washed herbs to the storage shed. The smell of wet earth and plant matter filled her nostrils. She paused, listening to the soft patter of rain, the distant call of a crow, the faint shuffle of boots moving across wet gravel. A single thought emerged, clear and simple: control without intrusion, authority without domination, dignity maintained by deliberate choice. Anna looked up at her, wide-eyed, and whispered, "It is different here." Elsa nodded slowly, eyes tracking Thomas in the distance. "Different," she repeated. And in the rain, with water tracing rivulets across the barracks and over the gravel yard, the camp seemed transformed. Order was maintained not by fear, but by deliberate care. Respect was enforced not through proximity, but through thoughtful absence. And the women, kneeling in the damp earth, handling soil and seedlings, realized that the space between them and their guards was itself a form of protection, a living boundary crafted to preserve both safety and dignity. By late afternoon, the rain began to ease, leaving the camp damp and cool. Elsa sat beside a row of vegetables to inspect her work, while Anna arranged trays for storage. In the distance, Thomas made his rounds, boots splashing softly in puddles, maintaining the quiet perimeter. The sun broke through the clouds briefly, casting light across the gravel and wooden structures, glinting on wet surfaces and reflecting off the leaves. Each shadow, each shaft of light, seemed to underscore the unspoken lessons of the morning: that care could be enforced silently, that respect could be measured in distance, that authority could coexist with humanity. Elsa touched the edge of a wooden tray and felt the cool, damp wood beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the symphony of rain, sunlight, and human movement that surrounded her. Somewhere in the camp, guards laughed softly, a sound familiar yet distant. Anna leaned against the storage shed wall, brushing soil from her hands. Elsa looked at her, nodded subtly, and both returned to their work, understanding without words that this was how a camp could function under the weight of history, the heat of a southern summer, and the quiet vigilance of men choosing to keep their distance while protecting human dignity. September arrived quietly over Camp Greene. The Georgia heat remained, but the mornings carried something different now. Cooler air drifted through the pine trees before sunrise, and thin layers of fog rested low across the gravel paths until the first light touched the fences. Elsa Reinhardt woke before the whistle, as she always did. For several moments, she remained still beneath her army blanket, listening to the camp breathe around her. Wooden beams creaked softly in the damp air. Someone coughed 2 bunks away. Outside, boots moved across gravel in slow, measured rhythm. Familiar rhythm. Predictable rhythm. She sat up carefully and glanced toward the narrow window above Anna Weiss's bunk. Dawn painted the sky pale blue behind the watchtowers. Somewhere beyond the camp, a train horn echoed faintly across the countryside. The sound no longer felt frightening. It simply sounded far away. Breakfast that morning was oatmeal, toast, and canned peaches served cold from metal trays. Steam rose from coffee cups while the women sat beneath the dim lights of the mess hall, speaking quietly among themselves. Elsa noticed something she had not seen during their first weeks in camp. Some of the women laughed now. Not loudly, not carelessly, but enough to remind themselves they were still human beings beneath the uniforms and numbers. Across the hall, Sergeant Thomas Miller stood near the entrance reviewing supply manifests beside Corporal Mary Collins. He drank black coffee from a tin cup while rain clouds gathered slowly outside the screened windows. Even indoors, he maintained the same distance he always had, the same invisible line. Elsa wondered suddenly if it exhausted him. Constant awareness, constant restraint, constant vigilance over details most people would never even notice. A young guard approached Thomas carrying a clipboard halfway through breakfast. "Supply truck from Macon is delayed again," the soldier said. Thomas nodded once. "Storm damage on Route 23 probably slowed them down. Should I move the afternoon cruise inside? Wait until noon. Weather changes fast here." The younger soldier glanced briefly toward the women eating across the hall. "You think the greenhouse detail should stay separate from maintenance today?" Thomas looked up slowly. "Yes. Even with the rain?" "Especially with the rain." The answer came calmly, automatically, as if no other option existed. Elsa lowered her eyes to her untouched peaches while something deep inside her shifted again. In Europe, power often searched for excuses to remove boundaries. Here, one man searched constantly for reasons to preserve them. Rain arrived before noon. Thick southern rain, warm and relentless. It hammered the camp roofs hard enough to drown conversation and turned the yard into slick red mud within minutes. Work crews rushed indoors while thunder rolled low over the pine forest beyond the fence. Elsa and Anna were assigned inventory duty inside the storage warehouse beside the greenhouse. The building smelled of burlap, damp wood, machine oil, and vegetables stored for winter supply. Lanterns glowed weakly against the storm-dark walls while rainwater rattled against the tin roof overhead. Elsa stood on a small ladder checking crate numbers against a clipboard when the lights flickered suddenly. One lantern near the entrance sputtered and died, throwing part of the warehouse into shadow. Thunder cracked overhead at nearly the same moment. Anna startled beside the shelving unit, knocking a stack of canned goods sideways. Metal cans crashed loudly onto the concrete floor and rolled in every direction. Instantly, the room froze. Elsa climbed down from the ladder quickly while guards outside reacted to the noise. Boots splashed toward the warehouse, entranced through the rain. One young private stepped through the doorway automatically before stopping short. Thomas Miller appeared behind him immediately. "Outside," Thomas said sharply. The private hesitated. "But the lights, outside." The younger soldier obeyed at once, stepping back into the rain. Thomas himself remained near the open doorway, without crossing fully into the warehouse. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his cap onto the wooden threshold. "Everybody all right?" he called calmly over the sound of rain. "Yes," Mary Collins answered from inside, while kneeling to help Anna collect the fallen cans. Elsa noticed that Thomas never entered, even with the storm raging and visibility poor. He simply stood beneath the doorway, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to preserve the boundary. Thunder shook the roof again. The warehouse darkened further. One of the women whispered nervously in German, while another lantern flickered weakly against the back wall. Thomas glanced outside toward the flooded yard. Then he removed a flashlight from his belt and held it out toward Mary Collins without stepping farther inside. "Use this," he said. Mary took it from his hand. "Thank you." Thomas nodded once. "Generator crew is working on the lines." Elsa crouched beside Anna, gathering dented cans from the floor. Her fingers trembled slightly from the sudden noise. Not fear of the storm. Fear of memory. Loud sounds still carried echoes of another world. Another war. Another life where darkness usually arrived before something terrible followed. Then she heard Thomas speak again from the doorway. Quietly this time. Not to command. Not to instruct. Simply to reassure. "It is only weather," he said. The words settled strangely in the room. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet Elsa realized no one had spoken gently to them during moments of fear in a very long time. Rainwater pooled across the warehouse entrance while thunder drifted farther into the distance. Eventually, the generator lights returned with a low electrical hum. The women resumed inventory work slowly. Guards remained outside beneath the overhang, while Thomas stood watch near the door, soaked almost completely through from the Storm. Elsa noticed the younger private glance toward him curiously. Why stay out in the rain? The soldier asked quietly. Thomas adjusted his cap slightly without taking his eyes off the warehouse. Because they should not have to wonder. The young soldier frowned. Wonder what? Thomas looked toward the women inside. Whether fear is coming through the door. Silence followed. Even the rain seemed quieter for a moment. Elsa lowered her eyes quickly before anyone noticed she had heard. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She thought about all the places fear had entered without knocking during the war. Hospitals, trains, streets, homes, entire countries. Yet here stood a man in soaked American uniform choosing rain over comfort simply because frightened women inside a warehouse deserved certainty. The storm finally weakened near evening. Clouds drifted eastward while pale sunlight broke through the trees in narrow golden beams. Water dripped steadily from rooftops and fence wire. The entire camp smelled of wet earth and pine needles warming beneath returning heat. Elsa carried the final inventory sheets toward the administration office shortly before supper. As she crossed the muddy yard, she passed near the maintenance shed where Thomas Miller stood wringing rainwater from his gloves beside two younger guards. One of them laughed softly. You know they are starting to trust us now. Thomas remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered quietly enough that Elsa almost missed it beneath the dripping rainwater. Good. Feels strange, does it not? The younger guard asked. Thomas glanced toward the women's barracks across the yard. Lantern light had begun glowing softly through the windows as evening settled over Camp Greene. No, he said calmly. It feels like the way things should have been from the beginning. Elsa kept walking without looking back. Mud clung to her boots while evening cicadas hummed from the darkening trees. Above the camp, the storm clouds finally broke apart completely, revealing a stretch of fading blue sky untouched by smoke or fire. For the first time in many months, Elsa realized she no longer counted the fences automatically. Whenever she crossed the compound, she counted the distances instead, the careful spaces left untouched between herself and the guards. The quiet boundaries protected every day without announcement. The invisible line one American sergeant refused to cross, even when nobody would have stopped him if he had.